By April 1945, it was clear that Nazi Germany would be defeated. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was steadily advancing. From the west, soldiers from the United States, Britain, and other Allied countries were also advancing rapidly. Germany was trapped on two fronts, but even though there was almost no hope of winning, Adolf Hitler still refused to surrender. He hid in his bunker beneath Berlin and ordered the capital to be defended to the last soldier. This was where the last major battle of World War II in Europe began, the Battle of Berlin. A few years before this, the situation was the opposite. In 1941, the German army attacked the Soviet Union. Millions of German soldiers advanced east and even came close to Moscow. They occupied many cities and vast areas of Soviet territory, but they were not able to completely defeat the Soviet Union. After several years of intense fighting, the Red Army gradually pushed the Germans back. From Moscow, Stalingrad, Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, the German army was forced to retreat until the war finally reached Germany itself. In January 1945, the Soviet forces reached the Oder River. This river was important because it was the last major barrier before Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. In some parts of the front line, Soviet soldiers were only about 60 kilometers away from the capital. At that distance, it was very close. Even so, the Red Army did not immediately advance, even though Berlin was already close to them. Many Soviet soldiers were also exhausted. They had been marching and fighting almost non-stop for several months. Food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, artillery shells, and vehicle parts also needed to be delivered to the front line. That's why millions of soldiers couldn't just charge forward without enough supplies. The Soviet commanders also had to make sure their flanks were secure first. If they went straight to Berlin while there were still strong German units in the north and south, their army's rear could be attacked and their supply lines could be cut. Because of this, the major advance temporarily stopped while the next operation was being prepared. In the initial plan, the final attack on Berlin could have started in May, but Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was worried. While the Red Army was positioned at the Oder River, the Western Allies were quickly advancing from the other side of Germany. They were crossing the Rhine, and many German defenses in the west were collapsing. Stalin feared the Western Allies would arrive first. The American and British armies aimed to reach Berlin first. Berlin was more than a military target. It was the Nazi capital, home to key regime buildings, Hitler's power center, and his hiding place. Whoever captured Berlin first would also have a major symbolic victory. It would reveal to the world who was really defeating the German defenses. It would show the whole world who finally brought down the center of Nazi power. Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower also said that Berlin was not the primary target of the Western Allies. It was more important for him to crush the remaining German forces and avoid a large number of casualties in a fierce battle inside the city. But Stalin did not fully trust this explanation. Because of this, he ordered the massive attack to begin immediately. Instead of waiting for May, the operation was set for April 16, 1945. To capture Berlin, the Soviet Union used three large armies, which they called fronts. A front was made up of several armies, including infantry, tanks, artillery, engineers, aircraft, and other support units. The largest force was the First Belarusian Front, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was one of the most well-known Soviet commanders during the war. He played a major role in the defense of Moscow and in other major operations against Germany. His forces would face the most difficult part of the attack. From the Oder River, they needed to break through the German defenses at the Seelow Heights. After that, they would follow the main road to Berlin and head straight to the city center. The Seelow Heights are high ground west of the Oder River. Because it is higher than the surrounding area, the German defenders could clearly see the Soviet soldiers and tanks approaching from the east. They could strike the attackers with artillery, machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons before they got close. To the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front was positioned. His job was to break through the German defenses at the Nesa River, then swing around to the south of Berlin. His goal was to cut off the roads out of the city and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the capital. It wasn't clear at first if Konev's forces would actually enter Berlin, but everyone knew there was competition between him and Zhukov. Both of them wanted to be recognized as the commander who would be the first to enter and capture Hitler's capital. In the north, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front was also prepared. His attack would begin a bit later. His main job was to prevent the German forces in the north from interfering with Zhukov's advance. Overall, the Soviet Union prepared a massive force for the final offensive. Around 2.5 million soldiers were involved in the operation. This included thousands of Polish troops fighting alongside the Red Army. They also had more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 40,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and thousands of military aircraft. In some parts of the front line, the cannons were placed almost side by side. Before the infantry and tanks advanced, the plan was to heavily bombard the German positions first. The goal was to destroy the bunkers, trenches, communication lines, artillery positions, and the roads used by the defenders. The Red Army had a large force, but that didn't mean their job was easy. Many of their soldiers were veterans of the war, but they were also exhausted. Some of them had been fighting for several years. Many had witnessed the destruction of their homes and the death of their families after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. They had a strong desire to end the war, but preparations for the final attack were also moving quickly. There were units that needed to be transferred, reorganized, and supplied immediately. Some soldiers lacked rest. Meanwhile, some of the commanders were still not fully familiar with the terrain they were about to fight over. German commanders knew stopping the Red Army was nearly impossible. The main German force east of Berlin, Army Group Vistula, was led by General Gotthard Heinrici, known as Pistola, who, unlike others, did not just follow Hitler's orders. Led by General Gotthard Heinrici, unlike the other Nazi commanders. On the other hand, he knew how to use the terrain, trenches, artillery, and concealment, making it extremely difficult to stop the larger enemy. To the south, there were also some parts of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner's Army Group Center. On paper, these were the main commanders, but Germany was extremely short on soldiers throughout the region. But stopping the real Red Army was a different matter, as many German divisions existed only in name. They lacked soldiers, tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, and vehicles. There were still some strong Waffen, SS, and Panzer units. These had veteran soldiers and powerful tanks, but many of their other troops were newly formed. They lacked training and were just assembled from different units. The defense also included the Volkssturm. This was a militia formed by the Nazi government during the latter part of the war. Because Germany was running out of regular soldiers, men who were not previously called up for military service were called up. Many of them were elderly men. There were also some teenagers who were still practically children and lacked proper training. Some were only given a rifle, a few bullets, or a Panzerfaust used against tanks. After brief training, they were sent to defensive positions to face a massive Soviet army. There were three main ones. Germany had three main lines of defense around the Seelow Heights. They built trenches, bunkers, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and concealed artillery positions. Some low-lying areas near the Oder River were flooded to make it difficult for Soviet tanks and infantry to pass through. Although some defensive positions were strong, the German command was already in chaos. Hitler was giving orders from his bunker, even though he no longer fully understood the real situation outside. He often forbade retreating, even when it was necessary to save the soldiers and form a better defense. Germany also no longer had enough fuel to quickly move their tanks and reserves. If the Red Army broke through the main defensive line, there would be only a few forces left to stop them before they reached Berlin. Many German soldiers knew this, but they continued to fight for different reasons. Some remained loyal to Hitler and the Nazi Party. Others were afraid of being punished by their own officers if they fled or surrendered. Many were also afraid of the arrival of the Red Army. For almost 4 years, the Nazi forces caused massive destruction in the Soviet Union. Millions of Soviet civilians and soldiers died. Many cities and villages were burned or destroyed. There were also mass executions, forced labor, starvation, and other crimes in the occupied areas. The German soldiers already knew that many Soviet troops were extremely angry. They were afraid that Germany would face retribution for what the Nazi forces had done in the East. So even though defeat was almost certain, many believed that they needed to hold back the Red Army, even if only for a few days. In front of them were millions of Soviet soldiers ready to end the war. Behind them was Berlin, the last center of Hitler's power. And between the two armies was the Seelow Heights, the last major defense that needed to be broken before the road to the capital could be fully opened. And at dawn on April 16, 1945, the massive Soviet attack began in eastern Germany. Thousands of artillery pieces and rocket launchers fired simultaneously along the Oder and Neisse rivers. Next, the German trenches, bunkers, roads, and communication lines were bombarded before the infantry and tanks advanced. But at the Seelow Heights, the first bombardment was not completely successful. General Gotthard Heinrici had predicted that the Red Army was about to attack. Before most of the shells landed, he pulled back some German soldiers from the first line of defense. Because of this, many Soviet shells hit positions that were almost empty. When the bombardment weakened, the German defenders returned to their positions. As the Soviet infantry approached, they were met by machine guns, mortars, artillery, and anti-tank weapons. The Red Army also used large searchlights to blind the Germans, but there was thick smoke, fog, and dust in the area. Instead of making it hard for the defenders to see, the shapes of some Soviet soldiers and vehicles became even clearer. This gave the German gunners easier targets. The terrain the attackers had to cross was also difficult. The plains were muddy and soft, so many tanks and trucks were forced to use the few available roads. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and supply vehicles quickly became congested. If a vehicle broke down in front, it blocked everyone behind. The long line of vehicles was also an easy target for German artillery. Within just a few hours, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's attack slowed down. His original plan was to wait for the infantry to break through the German line before sending in the large tank armies. But the defenses were not broken immediately. As the battle dragged on, the pressure on Zhukov increased. He knew that Marshal Ivan Konev's forces in the south were making faster progress. Because he didn't want to be beaten to Berlin, he ordered the tanks to advance immediately, even though the way wasn't clear yet. This made the battlefield even more chaotic. The tanks got mixed in with the infantry, who were lying down and hiding from German fire. Some vehicles couldn't move forward, while others ended up on the wrong route. But even though the first attack was chaotic, the Red Army didn't stop. They kept sending in new infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers. When one unit was held back, another group would try to break through a different part of the German line. The Panzerfaust was a major threat to the Soviet tanks. It was a small anti-tank weapon that could be carried by a single soldier. If a German soldier got close to the side or rear of a tank, he could destroy it with a single shot. That's why each group of tanks needed to be accompanied by infantry. The soldiers searched trenches, houses, holes in trees, where those carrying Panzerfausts might be hiding. For 3 days, the Red Army kept attacking while the strength of the German defenders was gradually being depleted. They were running low on ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, and rest. When a defensive position fell, it was hard to retake it because they had very few reserve units left. By April 19, Zhukov's forces had broken through the main German defenses at Seelow Heights. The cost was heavy. Thousands of soldiers from both sides were killed, wounded, or went missing in just a few days. Even today, records differ on the exact numbers, but it's clear that the casualties in the battle were enormous. While Zhukov was struggling at Seelow, Konev's army was able to break through in the south much faster. Some German positions in front of him were weaker, and his artillery attack was better coordinated before the soldiers crossed the Neisse River. Soviet engineers immediately built bridges so that the infantry, tanks, and supply vehicles could cross. Because of this, Konev's forces quickly reached the rear of some German units. Some of them retreated without clear orders. Some were separated from their commanders, while others surrendered because they no longer had a safe way out. When Stalin saw Konev's rapid progress, he allowed him to turn north towards Berlin. This meant that two Soviet forces were now rapidly approaching the city from different directions. The competition between Zhukov and Konev became even more intense. Both of them wanted to be the first to reach the center of Berlin. But as they accelerated their attack, their supply vehicles struggled to keep up. The tanks needed a constant supply of fuel. The infantry needed ammunition, food, and medical support. If the supply trucks were left behind, an entire unit could be forced to stop even without facing any enemy. The Soviet troops also struggled with forests, swamps, small towns, and narrow roads. In these areas, small German groups could hide. Sometimes they would let the Soviet tanks pass first before attacking the trucks and ambulances at the rear. Because of this, the Red Army had to check every village, intersection, forest, and bridge they passed through. On April 20, Hitler's own birthday, they had already reached within striking distance. In the ambulances of Nagbukasan, shells began to fall in the central part of the city. For the civilians, the situation became even more dangerous. There were air raids from the Western Allies, artillery from the Soviet forces, and battles approaching the suburbs. The basements of apartments and buildings were turned into shelters. Families crowded there, while the ground shook with every explosion. In some places, there was a shortage of water and food. Electricity and communication lines were also cut. Doctors and ambulances had difficulty reaching the wounded. Meanwhile, the German command system was almost collapsing. Soviet forces captured the military headquarters complex in Winsdorf, south of Berlin. Some German units retreating from the east also lost proper communication. One of the commanders who lost contact with Berlin was General Helmut Weidling. Amid the chaos, false reports spread that he had moved his forces without permission. An order was even issued for him to be hanged. Weidling went to Hitler's bunker to explain what happened. Instead of being executed, he was made the overall commander of Berlin's defense. His new duty was extremely difficult. He had to defend a large city using units that lacked soldiers, ammunition, tanks, fuel, and communication. He also did not have full control over all the defenders. There were the regular army, Waffen, SS, police, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm, and various groups, each with their own commanders. While chaos was happening outside, the situation in Hitler's bunker was also getting worse. On April 22, he was informed that the counterattack he expected from General Felix Steiner did not happen. On the map, it looked like he still had large armies he could use. But on the actual battlefield, many of those units were lacking soldiers, scattered or no longer capable of launching a major attack. Hitler got angry at his generals. He shouted that the military leadership had failed and betrayed him. In the midst of his anger, he admitted that the war was lost. But still, he refused to surrender. Later, he went back to making plans that could no longer be carried out. He hoped that the armies of Steiner, Walter Wink, and Theodor Busse would attack from different directions. The problem was, none of them had enough strength to break through the large Soviet force approaching Berlin. While Hitler remained in the bunker, several high-ranking officials of the Nazi government left the city one by one. This included Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, Karl Dönitz, and Albert Speer. Some of them claimed they had duties to attend to elsewhere. But for many Berliners, the message was clear. The leaders who ordered them to fight to the death were also the first to leave the danger. Himmler also secretly tried to negotiate with the Western Allies. He hoped that Germany could surrender to Britain and the United States while continuing the fight against the Soviet Union. The Western Allies did not accept this. They demanded the complete surrender of Nazi Germany, not a separate agreement against one Allied country. While this was happening, the forces of Zhukov and Konev were getting closer and closer to each other, with the goal of completely encircling Berlin and cutting off all major roads out. On April 24, several Soviet units joined forces in the southeastern part of the city. At the same time, a large part of the German Ninth Army and some units of the 4th Panzer Army were cut off in Berlin. They were trapped in the forests and small towns southeast of the capital. This area became known as the Halby Pocket. It wasn't only soldiers who were trapped there. Thousands of civilians who fled from their towns out of fear of the Red Army were also there. The area held by the Germans quickly shrank. They were bombed every day by Soviet aircraft and artillery. There was little food, fuel, and ammunition. There were also many wounded, but there was a shortage of medicine and vehicles to take them out. Hitler ordered General Busse to go to Berlin and save the city. But Busse knew that this was no longer possible. Instead, he chose to escape to the west and try to join General Vink's forces. The goal was to reach an area controlled by the Americans. For many German soldiers and civilians, it was better to surrender to the Americans than to be captured by the Soviets. They tried to break through the Soviet lines, using the remaining armored vehicles at the front. Behind them walked the infantry, the wounded, refugees, the elderly, women, and children. The roads through the forest were extremely crowded. When a vehicle broke down in front, the entire column would stop. When the Soviet artillery fired, people would scatter and hide among the trees. Many of the wounded were left behind because there was no more space in the vehicles. Some units changed direction several times because the roads they were taking were blocked. On April 28, a large group managed to slip through a weak part of the Soviet ring, but they still had to cross a wide area controlled by the Red Army. Before reaching Vink's forces, only a few made it out successfully. Many died, were wounded, or were captured in the Halby Pocket. Because the records differ, the exact number of casualties is uncertain, but it is recognized as one of the bloodiest parts of the Berlin operation. While the battle in Halby continued, the Red Army completely closed in around Berlin on April 25. There was no longer any major open route for the defenders to escape or for the reinforcements they were waiting for to enter. On that same day, Soviet and American vehicles met as they rushed towards each other.
Soviet at American soldiers
near the Elbe River. This meeting was significant because it showed that the remaining territory of Nazi Germany had been divided. From the east, the Red Army was already there. From the west, the Americans and other Allied forces were already there. But even though it was clear that the end was near, the crimes did not stop. On the German side, some SS and military police continued to arrest and kill their own soldiers who were suspected of deserting, surrendering, or suspected of cowardice.
Sumuko o tumangging lumaban.
There were bodies left on the side of the road with signs saying that the person killed was a deserter or a coward. The purpose of this was to scare other soldiers and force them to stay in their positions. There were also Nazi officials who killed political prisoners and other inmates before the Allied forces arrived. At the Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück concentration camps, the SS forced tens of thousands of prisoners to march away from the approaching Red Army. Many of them were thin, sick, and had almost no strength left. They were forced to walk long distances with little food, water, clothing, and rest. Those who could no longer keep up were shot or left on the road. Many also died from hunger, illness, cold, and extreme exhaustion. These forced marches were called death marches. The SS did this to prevent the prisoners from being liberated and to hide some of the evidence of their crimes. When the Soviet troops reached Sachsenhausen in April, they found several thousand prisoners who were too weak to be included in the march. Many of them could barely stand and needed immediate food, medicine, and medical care. But the Red Army was not innocent of abuses that happened as it advanced into Germany. There were Soviet soldiers who stole from houses, stores, warehouses, and farms. They took food, clothes, bicycles, equipment, jewelry, and watches. There were officers who tried to stop the looting and other violations. Some soldiers were also punished. But in many places, discipline was weak and enforcement was inconsistent. There were commanders who turned a blind eye, while others prioritized rapid advancement over investigating the crimes of their men. There were also former Soviet prisoners of war who were freed from German camps but were not immediately treated as victims. The Soviet government suspected them because they had been captured by the enemy. Some were investigated by the security forces, sent to special camps, or immediately returned to military service. For them, the suffering did not end immediately, even after they were freed from German captivity. Within just a few days, the situation around Berlin completely changed. The main defense in the east was broken. The German forces were trapped in Halbe. The Soviet and American armies met at the Elbe, and Berlin was completely surrounded. There was no longer enough troops to save the city. There was also no clear way out. But the battle was not over yet. The next stage would no longer take place in wide fields or highlands. It would now take place in the very streets, houses, subway tunnels, bridges, and ruined buildings inside Berlin. As the Red Army approached the center of Berlin, civilian life became even more dangerous. Many women became victims of sexual violence by some Soviet soldiers. Historians have different estimates of the exact number, but it's clear that the abuse was widespread. Some soldiers were punished, but most of the cases were never investigated. Meanwhile, intense street fighting had begun inside Berlin. It wasn't easy to capture the city because many buildings were destroyed and the roads were blocked, and many German defenders were hiding in houses, basements, railway stations, tunnels, and rooftops. The Red Army used small assault teams that included infantry, engineers, artillery, and armored vehicles. Instead of always crossing open streets, they would break through walls to move from one building to the next. Each block had to be taken one by one. Sometimes Soviet soldiers already held one floor, but there were still German defenders in the basement or upstairs. Because of this, the fighting was slow and bloody. The main target of the Red Army was the center of Berlin, where the Reichstag and Hitler's bunker were located. The Reichstag was important because it was a symbol of Germany's power. That's why the Soviet Union wanted to raise their flag there as a clear sign of victory. But before they could take it, they had to cross an open area while being fired upon by machine guns and artillery. When they got inside the building, the fighting continued on the stairs, corridors, rooms, and basement. In the end, the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag. On April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun. The next day, April 30, the two of them committed suicide inside the bunker. There is no solid evidence that Hitler escaped to Argentina or any other country. After his death, Karl Donitz was chosen as the new president of Germany, while Joseph Goebbels became the chancellor. But they barely had any real control over Berlin. On May, one German representative tried to negotiate with Soviet commanders. The Soviet Union did not agree to a limited agreement. They demanded a complete surrender. When the negotiations failed, Joseph and Magda Goebbels killed their children before taking their own lives. Some German soldiers and Nazi officials tried to escape from the city. Some managed to get through, but many were killed, wounded, captured, or forced to surrender. By May 2nd, it was clear that the fight was pointless. General Helmut Weidling ordered the remaining defenders to stop fighting. After that, he surrendered Berlin to the Red Army. The gunfire gradually died down. Civilians came out from the basements and shelters and saw the true extent of the destruction. Houses, buildings, bridges, stations, and roads were destroyed. Many parts of the city were filled with rubble, wrecked vehicles, and corpses. The Battle of Berlin ended on May 2, 1945, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed throughout the operation. It's hard to determine the exact number because the records are chaotic and so many are missing, but the result is clear. Hitler is dead. The Red Army now controls Berlin, and there is no longer any major force capable of saving Nazi Germany. On May 7, German representatives signed the unconditional surrender. The surrender was signed again in Berlin on May 8, and that was already May 9 in Moscow time. This is where World War II in Europe finally ended, but Germany did not immediately return to normal. It was divided into occupation zones by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin was also divided into West and East. Eventually, West Germany and East Germany were formed, and Berlin became the center of a new conflict called the Cold War. So the fall of Berlin did not only end Hitler's reign, it ended Nazi Germany, but it also opened a new division in Europe.